12 galleys drifted into the harbor of Messina under a bruised purple sunset in late 1347. From the shore, the watchers saw no flags waving and heard no sailors shouting orders from the rigging. There was only a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the very hulls of the ships as they rocked listlessly in the tide. When the first port authorities finally stepped onto those wooden decks, they didn't find a working crew. They found a graveyard that moved with the waves. The few men still clinging to life were no longer recognizable as human, their eyes hollowed out by a terror that transcended physical pain. They bore dark, unexplained marks upon their skin, shadows of an internal war that they had already lost. This was not an invading fleet of steel and fire, but a vessel carrying an invisible passenger that no wall could keep out. Within those wooden hulls, a phantom had already begun its work, moving with a lethal efficiency that defied every defense of the age. The conflict beginning that day was not between rival nations or competing kings, but between humanity and a threat that moved through the very air they breathed. It arrived without a sound, without a declaration of war, and without a face. The year 1347 marked the moment the world poised on the edge of a transformation that no one, from the lowliest peasant to the highest scholar, could have predicted. The sea, once regarded as a boundless source of life and trade, had suddenly carried a weight that felt unnatural. When the ships were finally ordered to leave the harbor, pushed back into the waves by a terrified populace, the gesture was already futile. The invisible passenger had already stepped onto the docks. It didn't need a passport, a horse, or a map. It moved through the simple touch of a hand, the exchange of a silver coin, and the shared warmth of a crowded tavern. This was the birth of an era where the greatest enemy was one that could not be seen or fought with traditional steel. The danger was everywhere, and the conflict was internal, a desperate, blind race to understand a threat that stayed 2 steps ahead of every barrier humanity tried to raise. In the narrow, winding streets of medieval cities, the air grew thick with a new kind of anticipation. People began to notice a pattern, a series of events that felt like a dark script being written in real time by an unseen hand. It often started with a subtle exhaustion, a heaviness in the limbs that many dismissed as mere fatigue from the day's labor. But soon, the signs became undeniable. The shadow moved through the population like a wildfire in a dry forest, a silent intruder that bypassed the thickest stone walls and the most guarded iron gates. The very architecture of the world, designed to keep enemies out, was useless against a traveler that moved with the wind and the breath of a friend. Historical records suggest that the sheer speed of this arrival was what truly broke the spirit of the people. In a world where news traveled only as fast as a galloping horse, this shadow seemed to be everywhere at once, arriving in distant villages before the warnings could reach them. It wasn't just a physical threat. It was a profound psychological one. The uncertainty of who would be next created a vacuum of trust that swallowed entire communities. Neighbors looked at each other with newfound suspicion, searching for the slightest sign of the mark. Families began to wonder if the very person they loved most might be the one carrying the invisible weight of the end. The bonds of blood and friendship, which had held society together for centuries, began to fray under the pressure of an enemy that turned love into a liability. This was a time of profound contradiction and a battle of the mind. On one hand, there was a desperate search for answers, a longing for some kind of logic to explain why the world was being dismantled piece by piece. On the other, there was a growing realization that the old ways of thinking were no longer sufficient. The conflict between ancient tradition and the harsh, cold reality of the present grew more intense with every passing day. Philosophers and thinkers of the era struggled to find a framework that could contain such a massive shift in the human experience. finding that their books and scrolls offered little protection against the changing air. The stars were consulted, and the ancient texts were scrubbed for clues, but the silence from the heavens was deafening. As the shadow moved northward from the sun-drenched ports of the Mediterranean to the damp, cold corridors of northern Europe, it appeared to evolve and adapt. Some observers at the time described it as a mist that settled over the valleys, while others spoke of it as a weight in the chest that could not be lifted by any medicine. The ambiguity of the threat only added to the terror. Without a clear enemy to point to, the fear turned inward, leading to a fracturing of society itself. People withdrew into their homes, locking doors not against thieves or marauders, but against the very idea of community. The streets, once vibrant with the sounds of trade and gossip, became corridors of silence, broken only by the occasional sound of a heavy cart or the distant tolling of a bell. The economic engines of the medieval world began to grind to a halt. Trade routes that had stood for centuries, connecting the east to the west, were abandoned as travelers were shunned like monsters. Fields that should have been harvested were left to the elements, the crops left to wither in the sun because there were no hands left to gather them. The very structures that held civilization together, the hierarchies of lords and peasants, were being tested by a force that didn't care for gold, titles, or borders. It was a great leveler, a mystery that treated the king and the commoner with the same chilling indifference. This created a tension that threatened to tear the social fabric apart at the seams, as those who had always been told they were chosen found themselves just as vulnerable as the ones they ruled. In the midst of this darkness, there were those who sought to find a deeper, perhaps more celestial meaning. Some looked to the stars, suggesting that a rare alignment of the planets had created a rift through which this darkness had poured. Others looked to the earth itself, wondering if the very ground was exhaling something ancient and long forgotten. These hypotheses, while lacking the precision of modern understanding, reflected a deep-seated human need to make sense of the senseless. The world was caught in a loop of questions with no easy answers, standing at a crossroads where the old gods seemed to have turned their backs. The conflict was not just physical but spiritual, a crisis of faith that left people searching for light in an ever-expanding darkness. The conflict also manifested in the heart-wrenching way people treated the suffering. There was a constant struggle between the primal instinct to care for the sick and the equally primal urge to survive. Stories emerged of mothers fleeing from their children and husbands abandoning wives at the first sign of a cough. In many cities, the sound of church bells became a constant background noise, a rhythmic tolling reminder of the losses being sustained hour by hour. But as the numbers grew, even the bells eventually fell silent. The silence was perhaps more terrifying than the noise, signaling a point where the scale of the mystery had overwhelmed the collective capacity to mourn. When there are too many to name, the names cease to matter and only the void remains. One of the most persistent questions that continues to fascinate modern observers is the role of the environment during this period. There are suggestions that the global climate was shifting into what some call a little ice age. This cooling may have weakened the resilience of the population, creating the perfect conditions for a silent traveler to thrive. This perspective views the event not just as a singular disaster, but as a complex intersection of biology, environment, and human behavior. It serves as a reminder that humanity is part of a much larger, often unpredictable system that we do not always control. The shadow was not just a guest on a ship. It was a symptom of a world in flux, a planet that was resetting itself in a way that was as violent as it was indifferent. The invisible killer didn't just take lives. It reshaped the very idea of what it meant to live. In the aftermath of the most intense waves, those who remained found themselves in a world that looked the same but felt fundamentally different. The power dynamics of Europe began to shift in ways that would have been unthinkable just a decade prior. Because there were fewer hands to work the land, the survivors found they had a new kind of leverage they had never possessed before. The old hierarchies were being challenged not by a revolt of weapons, but by the simple, harsh reality of supply and demand. This was a slow-motion revolution sparked by a threat that had no political agenda but changed every law and custom of the land. Even the art and architecture of the time began to reflect this dark era. The visual language grew more somber, focusing on the fleeting nature of existence and the inevitability of the shadow. The conflict between the desire for beauty and the reality of decay was captured in stone and on canvas. It was a period of intense reflection, where the mystery of existence was brought to the forefront of every mind. The theme of the Dance of Death became a recurring motif, a visual representation of the idea that everyone, regardless of status, was part of the same silent procession toward the unknown. Skeletal figures were depicted leading popes, emperors, and laborers alike in a frantic, joyless dance. A reminder that in the eyes of the shadow, all are equal. But what exactly was this traveler? While we often point to specific biological causes today, the experience of the people in the 14th century was far more nuanced and terrifying. To them, it was an atmospheric phenomenon, a moral crisis, and a biological disaster all rolled into one. The mystery remains because the impact was so total, reaching into every corner of life. It didn't just change the population count. It changed the way people thought about their place in nature and their responsibilities to one another. The scar it left on the collective memory of humanity is still visible today in our laws, our medicine, and our stories. We are the descendants of those who looked into the abyss and managed to look away. The story of the ships from the Black Sea is more than just a historical footnote. It is a stark reminder of how quickly the world can change when an invisible factor enters the equation. It highlights the fragility of our systems and the overwhelming strength of our fears when faced with something we cannot see. The conflict between the known and the unknown is a permanent fixture of the human condition, and this era was one of its most intense and crystalline expressions. We are still untangling the threads of that time, trying to understand how such a small, unseen thing could cause such a massive shift in the direction of civilization. It reminds us that our greatest vulnerabilities are often hidden in the things we take for granted. The air we share, the hands we hold, and the ships that bring us the world. As we look back at that landscape of abandoned villages and silent cathedrals, we can also see the seeds of the modern world. The crisis forced a total reassessment of how a society protects its people, leading to the early foundations of what we now call public health. It pushed thinkers to look for natural causes and observable patterns rather than relying purely on the supernatural. The struggle against the invisible killer was the catalyst for a new way of observing the world, a spark of inquiry that would eventually lead to the scientific breakthroughs of later centuries. In the heart of the thriller, we find the origin of the detective, the human mind trying to solve the ultimate mystery of survival. Yet the darkness of that period still holds its secrets. Why did it strike with such fury in some regions while sparing others just a few miles away? Why did it seem to vanish into the shadows only to reappear with renewed vigor decades later? The hypotheses are many, ranging from shifts in trade routes to subtle mutations in the shadow itself. But a definitive explanation remains elusive. It stays in the realm of the unsolved, a mystery that continues to haunt our understanding of how history is made. The traveler reminds us that there are forces in this world that operate on a scale and a timeline far beyond our immediate perception. moving through history like a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. The threat didn't need swords or fire because it utilized something far more potent, the very nature of human connection. It used our breath, our touch, and our fundamental need for community as its primary vehicles. This is the ultimate thriller, a story where the protagonist is an entire species and the antagonist is a shadow that cannot be caught. The tension of that era was the tension of a world waiting for a dawn that seemed like it might never come, held captive by a guest that refused to leave until it had finished its work. The conflict was not won by a hero in shining armor, but by the slow, agonizing passage of time and the resilience of those who refused to let the silence become permanent. In the end, the world did not end, but the one that emerged was unrecognizable to those who had lived before the ships arrived in Messina. The conflict had been resolved not through a decisive battle, but through a long, painful process of adaptation and survival. The danger eventually moved into the background, becoming a part of the new normal of the centuries that followed. But the memory of the invisible killer stayed, a lingering whisper in the wind, and a reminder that the things we cannot see are often the ones that have the power to change us the most. We carry the ghosts of 1347 in our very DNA, a testament to a war we don't remember, but whose consequences we live every day. As the sun sets over the ruins of that era, we are left with a profound sense of the mystery that still surrounds the transformation. It wasn't just a period of loss. It was a period where the invisible and the visible collided, leaving a trail of questions that we are still trying to answer. The dark thriller of the 14th century is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of the unknown. It serves as a shape on the wall of history, a silhouette that we recognize but can never fully define. The 12 galleys may have rotted away, but the shadow they cast remains as long as we continue to breathe the same air and walk the same streets. The journey of that shadow, from the cramped galleys in the harbor to the silent streets of the world's greatest cities, remains one of the most compelling mysteries of our collective past. It was a journey through the very heart of human civilization, exposing our vulnerabilities and our strengths in equal measure. No one saw it coming, and no one could truly see it, even when it was standing right in front of them. But the world it left behind is the one we still inhabit, a world forever shaped by the memory of a traveler that moved through the air like a ghost. We are still watching the horizon, waiting to see if the silence will ever return. We may never fully decode every secret of that era's destruction. Perhaps it is meant to remain a mystery, a recurring reminder of the limits of human knowledge. In quiet moments of reflection, we can almost hear the creak of those 12 galleys as they entered the harbor, carrying a burden that would rewrite the future of the world. The immediate danger is gone, but the conflict between our need for certainty and the reality of the unknown continues. The shadow is still there, just out of sight, a permanent part of the long, dark thriller of our shared human story, waiting for the next ship to drift into the harbor.